Until you've left, but thank you for coming in. Right. Sorry for that minor interruption. Well, good morning. Order, I should say, to start the official proceedings. Can I welcome Mike O'Grady, Deputy Head Organised Crime Operations North from HMRC Fraud Investigation Service, Simon York, Director, HMRC Fraud Investigation Service, Deputy Chief Constable Drew Harris from the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and Assistant Chief Constable Stephen Martin, Head of Crime Operations Police Service of Northern Ireland. You're all very welcome, and we are extremely grateful to you for giving up your valuable time to meet with us today so that we can take evidence formally from you as the Select Committee on Exiting the European Union. Now, I wanted to kick off by asking, and perhaps to Mr. Martin or Mr. Harris, on our visit to Dublin earlier in the year, we heard concerns that any new or visible border checks would provide an opportunity for those who are not reconciled to the peace and would wish to disrupt it to do things that they are not doing currently. And I wanted to ask, what is your assessment of that risk if we don't continue to have a border where people can cross and goods can move without any checks whatsoever? What is the degree of risk and how concerned are you about it?
Well, we know what the UK government's stated position has been about no infrastructure. If there's no infrastructure, then there's nowhere for protest, damage, criminal damage, or indeed terrorist attack. But obviously, violent dissident Republican groups see this as an area which is contentious, which will give them, in effect, a further rallying call to try and engender support and try and drive their recruitment. And so it is of concern. We know from information that we have that they have a focus on this. They see it as an opportunity, but that is for ourselves and our partners in Garda Síochána and MI5 to cope with, to deal with, and to thwart their in fact terrorist enterprises.
Now, clearly, with no border at the moment, the activities that they are engaged in, there isn't anything in relation to the border that they can direct that to. They're obviously involved in other activities that we hear about from time to time.
Well, we still have a severe terrorist threat here in Northern Ireland.
Indeed.
And indeed, in this year, there's been 4 attempts on the lives of police officers, and we've had numerous shooting and bombing incidents here as well. So 58 shooting incidents and 33 bombing incidents this year alone. So there is a threat. It doesn't often make it into the national press, but that threat exists. It's how then we manage any further growth in that threat. And very positive in that is that the UK have said that there will be no infrastructure in the border, because that would have been an obvious point for dissident groups to rally themselves around and to, as I say, attack, but also try and engender support and sympathy in local communities and further afield.
Well, as you say, the terrorist threat is very real. But if there were any infrastructure or any people or any places where vehicles had to be checked, then clearly the people doing that would need to be protected, and that would have implications for you and your colleagues.
Well, yes. Well, we work closely with other law enforcement agencies on the island, so both cross-border and the other UK agencies, so National Crime Agency and obviously HMRC and the Border Force. But we work at the moment, and I think we would tend to work going forward as well. It would be our firm intention to base our operations on intelligence, planned operations, coordination then with our sovereign counterparts to make sure that those operations can happen securely and safely, not only for the public, but also for our staff, law enforcement staff, but also in a way which is done with the community impact in mind. We want to act in a way which engenders community support for our actions in dealing with unlawful activity.
If I may just
Please,
add to supplement what the Deputy has said. So there is a severe threat, which means an attack is highly likely. Yep. There have been a number of national security attacks in Northern Ireland this year. Whilst the dissident Republican groups that we're currently facing do not have the the capability or capacity that the provisional movement would have had during the Troubles. They have demonstrated their ability to kill people.
Yep.
So I think if there was infrastructure such as you described, whether that be buildings and people, that re-emphasised the border in that physical, tangible, visible way, I think it's highly foreseeable that dissident Republicans would seek to take action against that, and that could include attacking the buildings and the people.
That's very clear and very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Timms.
Can I just follow up on that point? Suppose it was just cameras. What do you think? Would that be readily manageable?
Well, we already have an extensive automatic number plate recognition system within Northern Ireland, and unfortunately it does get subject to regular criminal damage attacks. So I would envisage that any infrastructure will face some form of threat, but and we obviously would have to manage that. But if we place infrastructure, it's very clear from what we know of their intentions that in some shape or form it would be subject to attack.
Thank you. Can I ask a question about smuggling? I think this is mainly to HMRC. I visited Northern Ireland regularly while the Good Friday Agreement was being negotiated 20 years ago, and I remember on the border, on the Northern Ireland side, you'd very often come across funny little petrol pumps where petrol was being sold cheaply, and it was clear it had been smuggled across the border, having paid a lower rate of duty in the Republic. There was quite a big problem with cigarettes coming across the border. What progress has there been in tackling smuggling since the Good Friday Agreement was concluded, and what's the current extent of smuggling across the border?
Okay, so thank you. So both the evasion of tax in relation to illicit tobacco and oils, as you describe, are both threats that my teams deal with across the UK. The oils threat is particularly significant, has been particularly significant in Ireland for many years. However, I think we're making really good progress. Actually, if we wheel back to about 2002, the tax gap that we computed, the amount of sort of duty we think was lost to that sort of activity, was about 1.8 billion pounds. That's in the UK. We now estimate it's down to about 100 million pounds. About 50 million of that is in Ireland, we think. But even here, the share of the illicit market's gone down from, I think it's 26% to 8%. So really significant progress, actually, in tackling that. You'll never completely eradicate that type of activity, but really significant progress in reducing the amount of duty that's lost to that sort of activity.
And how much of that is because the duty is less different between the Republic and the UK now than it was previously, or is it?
No, I think it's to do with a whole range of factors, and actually looking at oils is a good example of how we approach many of these organised crime threats through a blended approach of a number of different things, which will include intelligence gathering, include criminal investigations, but we have teams that go out and test vehicles or test oils petrol stations. But we've also had sort of legislative and process changes, so we require dealers in oils to register with us, so we can monitor all of that. And of course, a couple of years ago, we introduced a new marker alongside the Republic, and that's had a significant impact in reducing the amount of laundering that takes place. So that suite of measures, that bundle of sort of things that we do, that's made a real impact on that particular threat, and similar approaches we use with other threats as well.
Is there any smuggling in the other direction from the Northern Ireland into the Republic? Is there anything that is worth because of duty rates or something?
I'll turn to Mike if there's some more detail, but I mean it's not something we're so particularly focused on.
Ready?
Yeah, I'm not aware that there is a great deal of smuggling in that direction, but some of the organised crime groups, there is possibilities where cigarettes, for example, have come in through Europe, may have come into England and then would go to Ireland, but the bulk of it is going from the Republic of Ireland through to the UK.
Right. Just one more question, if I may. If Northern Ireland is no longer in the future in the customs union, and because of changes in duty rates and so on, the incentives for smuggling were to increase, what would be necessary at the border to handle an increased problem of smuggling?
So we don't think anything extra would be necessary at the border. We currently deal with smuggling in relation to a number of excise products, oils, tobacco. We have alcohol issues across the border, and we don't have checks at the border now for that type of thing. What will change if we left the customs union would be the amount of declarations that need to be made in relation to customs duties, and I know John Thompson spoke to you about that last week. And as John said, although the number of declarations that need to be made would rise significantly, that doesn't necessarily mean the risk would rise as significantly as the number of declarations. And certainly our assessment is that the major fraud threat, the major organised crime threat, will absolutely continue to be the sort of excise products that we're seeing now for a whole host of reasons, including duty differentials, but critically illicit, existing markets for those illicit goods. Criminals are in it to make profit, so they need a market to sell goods, and there is a market for those sort of products. We haven't got a crystal ball. Criminals will always take whatever opportunity they can to make a profit. And we will need to, as we have done, in a long history of dealing with this type of fraud here and across the UK, is be very alive to and continue to gather intelligence about what those criminals are doing, and adjust our operations to meet any changes in the way they carry out their activity.
Okay, thank you very much. Craig McKinley and then Vera.
Yeah, directed to the HMRC. I've done a lot of work on illicit tobacco, particularly because it's it's highly excisable, high value, very low volume. In terms of, I would imagine, I'm guessing, I don't know the duty rates in the Republic, but I would have thought they've sort of had to tag along with UK ones, otherwise you end up with a clear and obvious differential. But when you do have illicits in both the Republic and in Northern Ireland, which I'm sure you do, at the same sort of level that we have in the rest of the UK, where do you think the main source is on the island of Ireland? Is it across from the UK, or do you think the Republic borders and, I suppose, ports are a porous way in? And I'm just wondering how you might deal with that in the future.
So when you say the source, the regional source of the illicit product, or where they're
I'm just
arriving
thinking
in the
about
UK?
a route, potentially Polish cigarettes, travelling across Europe to a Spanish port, coming either into the Republic, or are they coming via Calais across the UK and into Northern Ireland and then across the island of Ireland that way?
I'll bring Mike in a moment for a little bit of operational detail on that. But we do see a real mixture. Tobacco smuggling is the biggest organised crime threat we deal with. It's worth over £2 billion a year to us. It's very much an international threat, driven by transnational organised crime groups. Cigarettes are sourced, whether they're counterfeit or what we call cheap whites, illicit cigarettes, from all across the globe, and often can travel all around the globe before they arrive here, and can arrive in a variety of different ways and through a variety of different entry points. But Mike might give you a little bit more on some of the main routes we see in relation to Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I think almost all of the controlled deliveries, which is a delivery where we have some influence, we're not in charge of it, but we're aware of it and we're monitoring it. So where we're monitoring those controlled deliveries, they've almost all come through Dublin port. Dublin's a bigger port than Belfast. Belfast had the smaller feeder vessels. Dublin is, because of the size, it's easier to hide a container of cigarettes within a big port than a small port. So almost invariably, our workers see cigarettes coming into Dublin port and up then across the border. That's not to say that there isn't some coming through the UK, but the vast majority, and certainly all the controlled deliveries we've done, have followed that route.
Okay, just one follow-up if I may. So, in the future, could you foresee that perhaps the Dublin route would be a route by which the whole of the rest of the UK could be seeing inbound illicits coming through?
I think, as Mr. York said before, we haven't got a crystal ball. It all comes down to economics, really. Is there a need when we've got Dover and the cost of that, the number of vehicles moving through, to reroute and put everything through Dublin? We can't tell. All we can say is we have got intelligence sources that we rely on all the time. We try and keep abreast of the ever-changing methods of operation of the organised crime gangs, and we try to react and respond as appropriate.
And much more illicit tobacco enters the UK in places other than Dublin now. So they aren't using that route now with an open border. We can't absolutely predict, but that wouldn't feel to me like something that would dramatically change.
Okay, thank you very much. Vera Hoppas on the same point.
Just to clarify, so if there was a customs border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, you don't think you would need to have any more physical checks in order to prevent smuggling either of people or of goods?
No, effectively we already have a border in relation to excise. There are already duty differentials. We are already dealing with smuggling, and we don't have border checks.
Okay, thank you. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you very much. You spoke very clearly about how you had a blended approach to organised crime. I was very interested to know from your point of view what elements of the UK's existing criminal justice and law enforcement cooperation with the EU you would say you currently rely on for your cross-border operations.
So that's a really important point for us. As I said earlier, organised crime and sort of serious fraud we deal with is increasingly and almost always international in nature to some degree. So we use a range of ways of cooperating and collaborating with those outside the UK, whether that's in the EU or beyond. But a number of the processes and conventions that we use with EU member states, we use a lot. They're very useful, and without them we would be significantly less effective.
What would be the ones you are using?
So things like the European Arrest Warrant. So that certainly allows us to bring fugitives, for example, back much more quickly than extradition. We have something called the...
What sort of difference can it make in terms of time for you?
Really significant differences. I haven't got those figures in front of me in relation to mainland Europe, but it can be years. And certainly in terms of numbers, so we have significantly more people in Ireland, for example, brought from the south to the north under European arrest warrants than ever happened with extradition. But we also have something called the Naples II Convention, which is a convention between customs organisations in Europe. That allows us to share intelligence with EU member states. So of all types. So that might be, to use Mike's example from earlier, there's a ship arriving in Dublin that's got illicit tobacco on it, and you might want to pick it up, or whatever. It might be quite specific like that, or more general. And it also allows us to seek assistance. So we might, for example, be able to ask the Dutch to do something for us in Holland, arrest people or search premises or whatever, obtain documents, and they can ask us as well. So there's a range of things like that. We also have mutual recognition of restraint and confiscation, which is quite important. So if we've got judgments in the UK, for example, or confiscation orders, that will be recognised in European member states. So that makes it easier to get hold of criminal assets that have been taken outside of the UK. So a whole range of really useful measures that we're using on a regular basis.
And just to check, can I just probe slightly further on that? So just to ask again. What information sharing systems you have, for example, the European Criminal Records Information System, and how you access those. Do you access them jointly, or do you have different operations north and south?
I haven't got all the detail of that. Certainly some things will be sort of HMRC specific, like the Naples 2 thing. That's a customs thing. Most of the other things I mentioned are law enforcement wide. Sometimes we have individual access to those, and sometimes one agency will do that on behalf of others, I think.
I wonder if Mr. Harris or Mr. Martin would like to come in on this point.
Certainly. So we would also highlight the European arrest warrant, very important for both the speedy removal of suspects to other nations, but also bringing suspects to this nation. And I think to Northern Ireland last year, we were engaged in 69 European arrest warrant movements of individuals. We would also access then the Schengen information system. That's a very important system for us. We use it at our ports, and so just addressing the point around human trafficking, one of the issues about the common travel area is that it is important to be able to identify really dangerous individuals moving through Ireland into Northern Ireland, and then maybe want to use the ports. And so we put a lot of emphasis on that. And last year we stopped over 700 people on the basis of checks at ports, and the Schengen information system drives that. So we would say that's essential in terms of just the security on this island, but also the security on into Great Britain. And we're putting extra resources into the ports to deal with that, because we are concerned about human trafficking as well. And also then, I've highlighted Eurojust, which the joint investigation teams, that's been very successful, particularly around human trafficking and drug trafficking. And we've had a number of very important operations which have dealt with trafficked individuals being trafficked between Northern Ireland and Sweden for the purposes of prostitution. And so the individuals have served sentences in the culprits have served sentences in Sweden, and then were extradited back to Northern Ireland to face the courts here as well. So that's very important to us as well. But also then PRUM, which is the hit-no-hit biometric check, and also then vehicle recognition system. Again, that's a system that we would highlight. And I think all of these systems can help our security, and we are engaged in the national programme to try, I think, to maintain these systems as best we can going forward. It will depend on our EU partners.
Do you have concerns about the implications of Brexit, or do you feel confident that whatever scenario we exit the European Union, that this will still be equally available?
Well, this isn't a one-way street. We give a lot of information in, which helps our European partners as well, and we work very hard around the information that we would put up onto the Schengen system through the police national database, but also then increasingly we are starting the rollout of PRUM as well, which will give us further technology, further information systems that will give us an advantage around identifying the critical offenders, people who've committed serious offences. So those would be concerns if they are lost, but we are highlighting into Home Office through the various committees we're engaged in the problems we see it and the need for these systems to go forward. But these systems are for a safer Europe, and it's not a one-way street. I think we have a lot to offer our European partners after Brexit.
Thank you.
Chair, might I come in on the later question I was going to ask, which is relevant?
Of course, and then I will come to Stephen. Yes, of course.
I was just wondering about the removal of the rights of free movement and how that would affect the policing of the common travel area, not only, I suppose, north-south, but also east-west to Scotland and to Wales as well.
Well, there is a common travel area on the island of Ireland, and there's been a commitment that will carry on. The common travel area brings a lot of benefits around the movement of people, and it's been in place for many decades here since partition, in effect. So we would want to see that maintained, but we are also aware that criminals use the common travel area to exploit people and through human trafficking or through immigration crime. And so our part in that particular would be around human trafficking, and we put a lot of effort into our ports to identify vulnerable individuals being moved through, maybe not under duress, but under duress or under some form of deception. And we've worked closely on the island, but also within these islands with the NCA around tackling human trafficking. But this is an issue which is already here. We have been dealing with human trafficking here for now nearly 10 years, and what we'll have to watch very carefully is how that threat would change over time.
I mean, would the removal of the free movement rights, would that complicate matters in terms of the work that you're already doing?
Sorry?
Would the removal of the rights of free movements complicate matters as to the work you're already doing?
Well, we envisage that there will be things will change. Obviously, there's a common travel area throughout Europe, and that seems as if that will change. But for our location here in Northern Ireland, we will still have to manage free movement right across the island. So we will have to look to the pinch points where we are able to identify threats of criminality, and that invariably is at transport hubs and ports and airports. And so that's where we'll concentrate our efforts in policing that particular threat.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to come back on this issue of EU-wide cooperation, obviously with crime becoming increasingly cross-border. Policing has to be as well, and you've mentioned a number of instruments such as the Schengen Information System, the European Arrest Warrant, PRUM, joint investigation teams, etc. And I think you've also mentioned that there are different scenarios for Brexit, of course, different types of Brexit, ranging from no deal at all through to a model which envisages very close cooperation. Have you done a study of each of those scenarios in the context of what it might mean for losing the ability to cooperate through these instruments with EU partners, and what impact that might have on the security of the island of Ireland and indeed more broadly for the United Kingdom?
Well, we're engaged on three pieces of work. So on a national level, we've engaged with the NCA and the National Police Chiefs Council around preparing, in effect, for Brexit. So there's work there on the cross-jurisdictional powers, so are currently afforded to UK by the EU. Also then we're engaged with our own Department of Justice here in Belfast around just policy, legislative, operational resource implications. But in particular then, we've also commissioned work jointly with the Acting Commissioner of the Garda Síochána around the implications of UK's departure. I think as a police officer, not wishing to stray into any sort of political domain, we are unsure of what the landscape's going to look like going forward. But we know certain things are going to change, and our responsibility and Garda's responsibility is to do its very best to maintain safety and security of everyone in this island. So we are very firmly focused on that. We have a very good working relationship with Garda Síochána, but a working relationship has to be backed up with legislation and policy which allows things like information sharing, allows intelligence to be shared, allows in effect evidence also to be shared quickly, and so that investigations can move on at a pace. So those are the things that we wish to address. Uniquely probably for ourselves, we also have an intergovernmental treaty which affords police-to-police cooperation on the island of Ireland. So that will still exist beyond Brexit, and we want to make sure that the provisions which will still exist are used to their full. Again, and that's around police-to-police cooperation. And what we're very clear about is that the border areas in particular don't feel that they are now, they've become less safe, that they could be subject to crime, and in effect people can use the border as a means to obstruct justice. We've worked very hard over the last 15 to 20 years to increase the feeling of safety and respect for the rule of law and order and lawfulness in those areas, and we don't want to lose that ground. And that's why we're working closely with Garda Síochána in respect of this and scoping out what might be done.
Thank you very much for that. The central management of these instruments is, of course, on continental Europe, sometimes in Brussels or sometimes in other cities through the agencies of the EU across continental Europe. Are you engaged in dialogue with those authorities? I guess it's a three-cornered triangle, isn't it? It's yourselves and the Republic of Ireland, but also on the EU side, to start to sketch out some of the scenarios where you could have equivalence to the Schengen information system, an equivalence to the European arrest warrant. Of course, that equivalence can only be agreed. As you say, it's a two-way street. It would need to have the agreement of the EU side and of this side. So I'd be interested to know what sort of dialogue you're having with the rest of the European Union on these things.
Well, we're not having a direct dialogue. Our dialogue will be facilitated primarily through our involvement with our own Department of Justice here, but also then the national law enforcement working groups that we're involved in, both the NCA and the NPCC. They are making representations on behalf of, in effect, UK Policing PLC as to what after Brexit the criminal justice policing landscape should be, and what assistance, what structures we need in place after that. Mm-hmm. So that's been driven in effect by the centre. Yeah. So we wouldn't have direct conversations into that, but certainly we would bring our influence and our particular factors, and that we have a land border to bear in this.
So that's the same for us. The Home Office are leading on a sort of criminal justice, law enforcement, security discussions, so that they're building that picture. We're feeding into that with our evidence, really. So we're just talking to the Home Office, who will be pulling that picture together. But as Mr. Harris said earlier, there is a real mutual interest in certainly in law enforcement, customs, tax authorities, whatever, across Europe in retaining really good ways of collaborating and sharing intelligence, for example.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Indeed. Richard Graham.
Thank you. Deputy Chief Constable, obviously what we're really looking at is the sort of likely risks and opportunities from different scenarios around Brexit. And your Chief Constable has given evidence to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee on aspects of this. He's said, in a sense, two slightly different things. One is that, come what may, the relationships that you got with the Garda would be unchanged.
Yes.
And that you wanted to have an unpredictable and agile policing of the border. And then, on the other hand, in terms of understanding what the situation would look like under no deal, you and he have been working together on the police-to-police report, which I think is going to come to you by the end of the year.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of what you see as the major risks? You touched earlier on joint investment teams. I mean, if hypothetically there was this no-deal scenario, would you be able to carry on, actually, just agreeing with your counterparts to have joint investment teams?
Well, we'd have to. We would have to fall back onto the other existing legal provisions. In effect, if we were going to transfer information, intelligence, and indeed evidence, then we'll have to fall back on the structures which will continue to exist. The intergovernmental agreement does create some of those structures, but the piece about evidence would require international letters of request. And so that is a longer, probably more laborious process. And finally, then, the European arrest warrant provisions would have gone, and in fact, we would need a new extradition treaty with Ireland to manage movement of suspects backwards and forwards.
Is your understanding that you would need a formal extradition treaty rather than, say, a simple government-to-government agreement on the cross-border policing issue?
For extradition, which is a judicial process, I think that would require a treaty. The sharing of information we can manage on the basis of the intergovernmental agreement. The sharing of evidence then would become, in effect, also a prosecutor-to-prosecutor process as well. So that would be beyond police-to-police cooperation.
So in your police-to-police piece of work, does that include what you believe would be the legislative requirements in the event of a no deal?
Certainly, it covers areas including information sharing, so that's most important, and that allows us to share information, but also the intergovernmental agreement. It was written at a time and included provisions which are within EU treaties. So any of those provisions then, which the intergovernmental agreement also included, would fall away. So the intergovernmental agreement specifically references joint investigation teams. Joint investigation teams requires membership of Eurojust. That may fall away. So that would fall away then out of the intergovernmental agreement as well. So. And I think in lots of ways you can focus on, the organised crime and the threat of drug trafficking or human trafficking, but one also has to think simply of things around, drunk drivers evading prosecution and evading disqualification and thwarting that, as we have done. Also then gangs coming across the border, going in either direction, committing burglaries, going backwards and forwards, and trying to use the border to thwart our efforts. So it's not just the international crime. This does fall down to the risk of, in effect, crimes of dishonesty and burglary and normal incidents that both police services are dealing with.
And if I might, Chairman, the last short one. Deputy Chief Constable, maybe for both you and Assistant Chief Constable, really. In terms of the value of the relationship between the two forces on either side of the border, to the extent that you're able to broadly assess, what's your understanding about how much value you're able to get from the help and cooperation, cross-border intelligence and so on from the Garda, and vice versa? I.e., to what extent is actually an equal relationship of equal value to both sides or not?
Well, we would see ourselves being involved in a very, very strong partnership with Garda Síochána, and I know that they view it in the same way. But perhaps I'd ask Stephen maybe to give some concrete examples of the operational work that goes on.
We would be in contact with Garda Síochána every day at different levels. So, for example, under the 2002 legislation, we have an MOU with Garda Síochána about intelligence sharing in relation to sex offenders. Several times a week, we would be in contact with Garda Síochána, and they would be in contact with us, sharing intelligence around sex offenders that we believe are moving from one jurisdiction into the other jurisdiction.
That wouldn't change, would it?
That wouldn't change if our interpretation of the 2002 bilateral between the two, between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom government is correct. As the Deputy says, some aspects will fall away because some aspects of that 2002 legislation actually is dependent upon EU membership, but we believe that the MOUs, as such as I have described, would not. We routinely engage with them around criminal intelligence. So, for example, in the Republic of Ireland, in really the last 12 to 18 months, they have had a really significant concern, a feud between two organised crime gangs, the Hutch gang and the Kinahan gang. I'm sure you've seen it on the media. Many people have lost their lives in this feud. We engage with Garda Síochána and provide intelligence and information in relation to that, and they share it with us. That is very regular. Detectives working with detectives. We share information in relation to road traffic collisions where people, recently there was a fatal road traffic collision in the north and the person went south, and Garda Síochána worked with us in that. So it's across the whole spectrum of crime, from national security, working hand in glove with MI5 and crime and security in the Republic, right down through all aspects of criminality. It is a good partnership. Indeed, the Chief Constable and myself are going down next week to meet the Acting Commissioner about cross-border crime. We have the Joint Agency Task Force that came out of the Fresh Start Agreement with the parties in Northern Ireland. I co-chair that with the Deputy Commissioner. That is a partnership made up of both policing organisations, but also the National Crime Agency, HMRC in the UK, the Revenue Commissioners in the South, Home Office Immigration. We've identified priority crimes. We're working together. We have joint assessments, analytical documents, intelligence sharing, and that works very productively. And I suppose our ambition is that post-Brexit we can have the same capability.
And just to be clear, ambition, is that word your expectation?
It is our expectation. We've made that very clear to HMG about the range of provisions that we enjoy now, how they play a part in allowing us to actively investigate crime, bring people to justice, and that really, in our view, must continue, but it also requires political developments, not just good cooperation between law enforcement agencies.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Peter Grant.
Thank you. A couple of questions primarily for our colleagues in PSNI. Richard mentioned the evidence the Chief Constable gave in October to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee when he mentioned a piece of work that had been commissioned really to look at the possible implications for policing, particularly around the border area, of different sort of Brexit scenarios. And my understanding was that that was intended to be completed by the end of the calendar year. Are you able to tell us, is that work completed? Is it likely to be completed?
A first draft is completed, and the Chief Constable and myself are going down to discuss it with the Acting Commissioner next week.
I can appreciate that aspects of it will clearly not be suitable for wider circulation or publication, but is the intention to make any of the findings available either to this committee or to Parliament through some other channels, so that if there are implications for the effectiveness of policing arising out of different Brexits, so that Parliament is given an indication as to where your thinking lies?
Well, yes, I think it is a document that could be shared with this committee. It may require some just careful look at, because we might be setting out some of our tactical weaknesses as we would see them, and we wouldn't wish to put those in the public domain, but by and large the vast majority of the document would be suitable for the public domain.
Thank you. Forgive my ignorance, but where does the line of political accountability for PSNI lie? Does it go through the Northern Ireland Executive?
Yes, so we have a policing board which holds the Chief Constable account, and then we have a Department of Justice, and we have a Minister for Justice then, who's responsible for our cells and prisons, courts, etc.
And just to add that national security is a reserve matter, and on those matters of security, it's to the Secretary of State and the NIO.
Yeah. Okay. What impact does it have on your preparation for Brexit in the devolved areas, I suppose the kind of the routine sort of policing? What impact does it have on your preparations from the fact that we don't have a functioning Northern Ireland executive and we haven't had for some time? Is that something that affects you in that way, or are you able to just carry on?
Well, we do carry on, but it's now 10 months, and in that time a lot has happened. The debates have moved on. Some things have become clear, and some haven't. We have worked with officials, and we've certainly made sure the Northern Ireland voice is heard at a national level, but also then legislative matters which passed at a national level, which required consent motions in Stormont, have not happened. So some of our legislative provisions around fuel laundering or money laundering have fallen behind, for instance. And so legislatively we are losing out. We're losing out on law enforcement tools, but also then we're losing out in the political discussion and direction that we would have received in respect of even just the North-South political relationship, which in effect underpins our work in respect of both the Organised Crime Task Force and this work that we're going to take forward with the joint scoping exercise. I just think that it would have been really good to have a Department of Justice Minister pushing this on as well.
Okay.
Just one more. How confident are you that PSNI is and will continue to be adequately resourced for any additional any additional challenges that Brexit might present?
Well, we've already identified issues that we think are start to arise. We have covered off some of these in respect of our presence at the ports, and we've asked specifically for that. We do receive, obviously, main grant funding from our Department of Justice, but we also receive additional funding around the security situation, so additional security funding, which comes from Treasury through the Executive, and we've also received funding to deal with paramilitary groups as well. So we have a number of funding streams, and we are building those up to counter organised crime threat, but also the threat from violent dissident Republicans and indeed loyalist paramilitaries as well. So in some ways, the policing issues that we face now will carry on. I think it's difficult for us to see just what's going to be new. We just don't know how they'll change. Will they amplify? Will they diminish? And certainly, as you've heard, the issue around oils has significantly diminished. And even I was looking at cash and transit robberies, which we had huge problems with 10 years ago. We had 160 in 1 year, and last year I think we had 1. So, you know, if you apply yourselves, and law enforcement can make a big difference, and we want to be able to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my question is principally to Mr. O'Grady and Mr. York. Last week we heard from John Thompson evidence where he expressed confidence in his belief that future approaches to managing cross-border issues, whatever happens with the border and however Brexit turns out, whether that Northern Irish border becomes an EU customs frontier, his belief that the current approach of handling day-to-day border issues, so risk-based and intelligence-led investigations, but deploying technology as well, that approach would continue. Are you able to give us a flavour of how technology is being used now and potentially in the future to what Mr. Thompson did indicate that could change in the future is a greater reliance on technology, and he likes to draw a distinction between what he describes as 21st century solutions and 20th century solutions. So as people who are currently using technology now and handling a very difficult border area, can you give us a flavour of how technology could be used in future?
Okay, so I think some of the issues Mr. Thompson was talking about, using technology in relation to the broader sort of customs declaration type process, isn't really my area of expertise. I can't help you an awful lot on that. I'm sure we could give you something in writing if you wanted that. Certainly, in the world of sort of law enforcement, it's becoming a more and more important part of what we do. Data analytics is particularly important. We now receive enormous amounts of data and intelligence from all sorts of sources, and ability to quickly, intelligently, with great insight, get into all of that really helps us. So that's one example of the way we work, and it's broader than just my area. That the whole of HMRC relies on that sort of approach to what we would call risk assess, and trying to identify where risks are, identify where we might want to intervene in whatever way that is. And I've been around this sort of business for a long time in HMRC, and I've seen that dramatically change the way we run our business over the last decade, from something that was a very paper-based, local knowledge-based system to one that is really crunching vast amounts of data to great effect.
So this is quite important, because at the heart of the government's proposals as they stand at the moment for ensuring that there isn't a hard border between north and south, whatever happens with customs arrangements, they are putting a great emphasis on reliance on technology. And I guess one of the things that we have to do as a committee is assess the extent to which that faith is well placed, really.
Yes, and as I say, I think the main thing we're talking about there is the broader sort of customs declaration system. I think I'd go back to what I was saying earlier, that we still think the main fraud threat will be in the excise area, and we're already dealing with that. That's not going to change. Well, I say it's not. Things, certain aspects could change, but essentially, we think that will remain the same threat, and we think we will have broadly the same approach to that. Criminals are opportunistic; they may change the way they do some of it. Leaving the EU may bring some changes to certain of the organised crime threats we're dealing with. Things like alcohol fraud or some of the complex VAT frauds rely to a degree, or some aspects of it rely to a degree, on European systems. If they're no longer there, that fraud would change. It wouldn't disappear. It would change. So we absolutely need to keep alive to all of that. But overall, we think that's still going to be the main area where we're interested in from a fraud perspective.
So to conclude, then, leaving the customs union shouldn't necessitate an increase in routine checking, and therefore shouldn't require new permanent infrastructure.
I think Mr. Thompson was really clear what the government's position is and what HMRC's position is we don't believe there's any need for any permanent infrastructure at the Irish border.
Okay, thank you very much. Pat McFadden.
Assistant Chief Constable, I just want to ask you another couple of questions about what you were talking about a few minutes ago. You and Mr. Martin have painted a picture for us of very good day-to-day cooperation with the Garda, underpinned by some of these things like European arrest warrants, Eurojust, joint investigation teams and so on. You're both very experienced police officers. Could you compare this to, say, the situation 20 years ago? I mean, how's it differed from then?
Well, I think before, particularly the European arrest warrants, extradition on the island of Ireland was very difficult. And I served in this border area 30 years ago, and we had good relationships with An Garda Síochána then. We just didn't have the legislative vehicles underpinned by EU treaties, etc., for us to work as well as we might. And in effect, people did commit crime on one side of the border to flee across to evade the police, and that occurred in all forms of criminality. And also at the time we had a hugely severe terrorist threat which had to be policed as well. And it's regrettable that a lot of the conversation about the border takes us back to where we were in the 80s and shows the infrastructure of the 80s when we, certainly in law enforcement, can see no rationale for any of that infrastructure at the moment. But I would repeat what I said earlier. It's good that our relationships are strong. We work well together. We can see that. We work to the benefit of the border communities, but also safety of people on the island of Ireland. But it does require both legislative and policy underpinnings to allow that to happen, so that we can share the evidence that it can't be challenged, and so that we can transfer individuals quickly to face justice.
So, absent those legal underpinnings, which weren't there in the same way 20 years ago, the border at that time was used by some criminals to facilitate their crime by crossing it at their convenience.
Yes, well, there was the obvious problem of terrorism, but if I move away from that, I remember the particular issue there was around aggravated burglary, so the burglary of older people in particular in their homes, which was a very prevalent crime 25, 30 years ago, and that was a cross-border crime. And we would have spent a lot of time on the border, not just around the security situation, but also around crimes of robbery, serious burglaries, thefts, etc. And people did evade us. We had criminal gangs that did evade police in both jurisdictions through using the border. And I would repeat what I said earlier. We've worked hard over the last 20 years to make sure that's not the case, and actually, through that, to promote safety in those areas, but also promote lawfulness and the respect for law and order in those areas as well.
My final question is just on that you said at the end. I'm quite interested in what you said about a sense of lawlessness that seemed to be there in the past. What in your mind is the risk here if we don't get this right in the future? What is there that could be lost?
Well, I think what's well. In some ways, I don't want to paint the worst case scenario, because you can start to conjure up, these demons of fear, etc., around this. But what we want to concentrate on is that we don't diminish from where we are at the moment, and I don't see that as necessary. We can work through what is required so that relationships are maintained and are underpinned by some structures. And secondly, then, that we and An Garda Síochána continue to have a focus on community safety, serving the public in the border area so that they know that they're safe, that there's no idea of this sort of raiding backwards and forwards, that in effect people don't use the border to facilitate crime and evasion from justice.
I think it's also, sorry, Chair, I was just going to make a point. I think it's, to illustrate it, if for example, a man living in the Republic of Ireland came to Northern Ireland and committed a very serious offence of rape and went back into the Republic of Ireland, that man would now know that we would come after him and execute a European arrest warrant if we had the reasonable grounds to have one, and we would bring him back to face the law in the north. Whatever happens as a consequence of Brexit, that sense of knowing that you will be brought to justice and that the Republic of Ireland administration and ourselves, either side of the border, can come after you and bring you to book and bring you to justice, must be retained.
Did you just want to add something?
I just want to quickly reinforce that from an HMRC perspective. So almost all of our counter-organised crime work here in Northern Ireland involves cooperation or collaboration across the border. And we have excellent relationships with our partners across the border. But to be absolutely clear, that is underpinned by various EU processes, Europe-wide processes, and we would definitely be less effective if they weren't there.
What are those EU processes?
Well, those are the sort of things we talked about earlier, whether it's intelligence sharing, whether it's the arrest warrants, whether it's confiscation of criminal assets, whether it's access to databases or joint investigation teams, the whole range of those things.
Thank you. Thank you. Christopher Cho.
Am I right in thinking that the Irish Republic doesn't participate in the Schengen information system? And if so, why is that? And what difference would it make if they did? Surely, if they're now going to be faced following Brexit with an EU border across between Northern Ireland and Ireland, then it would be much better for the EU if Ireland was part of the Schengen information system.
Well, my understanding, sir, is that they are moving towards membership of the Schengen information system that we presently are also members of. So that particular issue is being addressed by the authorities. I'm not sure if they're there yet, but I know that there's work underway that they will also achieve membership of the Schengen information system.
And what are the problems? Why have they not yet joined the Schengen information system?
I'm not entirely clear, but the Schengen information system does make demands of the IT system that you have that joins onto it in effect. And I think a lot of it is the technological issues involved in joining on to a pan-national information system.
So this is planned to be introduced before March 2019?
I couldn't comment on the timing, sir. I don't know what progress they're making in terms of joining on to the system.
And I think Mr. Martin was saying that you made about 900 arrests using Schengen information system in last year. And the fact that the Irish Republic doesn't belong to it, is that reducing the number of arrests that can be made at the border?
We use our system, and we've achieved the results we have with it. I think what we have seen is that criminal gangs will try and evade law enforcement by entering into the Republic of Ireland and then moving into Northern Ireland, then to use ports to move across into GB, and that's to try and evade Schengen-type checks. So it is an important information system which directly combats the illegal movement of individuals or the movement of criminals or wanted persons.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, there's a couple of colleagues who've come in already, but just want to come back briefly. I think Craig was first.
If I may, Deputy Chief Constable, obviously had the Belfast Agreement 98, came into force in late 99. We're in a very different, I think, relationship with the Republic post that as before. And I think you were probably for you to answer. You were describing the situation on the border, I think, pre-Belfast Agreement. You mentioned we've got PRUM, which has only been in place for a year or two.
Yes.
European Arrest Warrant, I'm not quite sure the timing, 12 or 15 years at best. So we had a sort of a period post-implementation of the Belfast Agreement, but pre the implementation of these other tools that we've now got available under EU systems. Did you have sufficient sort of bilateral agreements? I know the Deputy was saying about memorandum of understandings.
Yes.
Did you have sufficient sort of oomph and understanding and data transfers and all these things that you needed at your fingertips as a result of the post-Belfast Agreement before these more advanced European systems came in?
Well, I would say these things really accelerated with the patent reforms, which began really in 2000, and the intergovernmental agreement is dated 2002. So that was to fill in specific gaps, which were operational gaps identified by both organisations and indeed Northern Ireland Office at the time and the equivalent in Dublin. So there was a ministerial drive to fill in these gaps around information sharing, but also things like secondments, training and civil contingency, so dealing with a civil contingency on the border as well. So yes, so there was an issue, and the 2002 intergovernmental agreement was our means of addressing that. And then subsequent to that, the law enforcement European cooperation has kept on moving on. And we have been, as an organisation, very actively engaged in that. We've engaged in a lot of the EU research projects around criminal justice, and we've applied our expertise to the European research projects. So we've been active in that front, but things always move forward, and that's in part 2002 was superseded by things like European Arrest Warrant, creation of Eurojust, the Schengen systems and the PRUM systems, but it's still there and it still facilitates good operational cooperation.
Okay. Just very briefly, the 2002 agreement, did that allow you to have very rapid extradition?
No.
That's as sort of quick as EAW?
No, it didn't cover extradition, no, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Vera Hobhouse.
Very quickly, but maybe you cannot help, but I'm trying to think through what you've been saying. So I think it is well understood that your cooperation is underpinned by EU agreements. For example, the Schengen exchange systems. Are you aware of, and I fully understand that is probably one of the things that you would very much welcome if that could be retained. Are you aware of that if we retain any of these agreements, that the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice would be sort of coming back in through the back door if these sort of things were going to be retained?
No, I'm not aware, no, and I hadn't even thought of that question.
Okay, and lastly, Seema Malhotra.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's just a point of clarification to Mr. Harris, if I could. I know that you mentioned that representations have been made to the Home Secretary about some of the systems that you currently have and how you might want to consider the future. I just wanted to clarify whether those representations have come directly from the PSNI or whether that's through any other umbrella body.
What it is at a national level, NCA and the National Police Chiefs Council have been leading on a piece of work which then feeds into the overall Home Office picture. So the Home Office also have to consider not just the policing needs, the NCA needs, and also Border Force and HMRC and other law enforcement. And so we are feeding into the national picture, but as I've said, it's very important we're there because we're bringing our own perspective in that we have a land border, we have this intergovernmental agreement, and we have the very practical policing problems of just, policing a rural border with market towns interspersed on either side of it.
So would the representations have been sort of written representations into the Home Secretary?
We have membership of a committee. I'm not sure what papers we've submitted or whether we've helped draft papers on behalf of the committee as opposed to submitting, in effect, our own case. I'm not quite sure.
Got it. Okay. And so what's the specific committee?
I'm not sure the name of it. It's chaired by an Assistant Commissioner from the Metropolitan Police and involves ourselves and Police Scotland. Do you know?
No, I don't know the name of the committee, but the co-chairs are Matt Horn, who is a Deputy Director of the National Crime Agency, and Deputy Assistant Commissioner Richard Martin from the Metropolitan Police Service.
That's really helpful. Well, thank you very much indeed. First of all, can I thank you all for coming? We've certainly got a really strong sense of the cooperation that there is between you and the cooperation that there is across the border currently, and I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. Can I also say particularly to you, Mr. Harris, and you, Mr. Martin, how much we as a committee appreciate the bravery of you and your colleagues in the face of the continuing terrorist threat, and we wish you every success in your work. Thank you for coming. That concludes the session. Order, order.
Thank you.